Hello and welcome to this Lloyd C. Gardner research presentation. My name is Akansha Khurana, and for my research project, I investigated the impact of perceived polarization on levels of voter turnout in American national elections, and I did so under the advisement of Professor Catherine McCabe of the Political Science Department. It's an obvious assertion that people are unlikely to turn out to vote in a one-sided election, or in an election where the outcome has already been decided. However, U.S. national elections have two primary candidates of differing or opposing ideologies, and this lends itself to political polarization, which is defined as the dissimilar attitudes between political parties and its members. For the purposes of this investigation, it is important to make the distinction between political polarization and perceived polarization, because Americans have a consistent tendency to overestimate the extent to which the parties are polarized, and it is the perception of polarization itself that influences voting behavior. On one hand, a healthy level of polarization in a democracy is not only inevitable, but it also mobilizes political activity in the form of voting. On the other hand, too much polarization has been found to negatively impact democracy by creating less willingness to negotiate and compromise. One influence on perceived polarization is negativity in the media, and a study conducted found that negativity in ad campaigns surrounding a 2006 U.S. midterm election caused diminished perceptions in government and actually decreased voter turnout. Voting is the simplest form of democratic participation. However, the studies observing the impact of perceived polarization on voter turnout are minimal, and the investigations that have been done yield mixed results. As such, this investigation set out to answer the question, is there a level of perceived polarization that elicits an optimal amount of voter turnout? It was hypothesized based off of former studies indicating the negative impacts of perceived polarization on voter turnout, that at a certain point, if perceived polarization reached levels that were too high, the voter turnout would actually begin to decrease. To answer this question, data from the American National Election Study was utilized from each national election year from 2000 to 2020, in which participants were asked to rate the Democrat and Republican parties on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 indicating most liberal and 7 indicating most conservative. The perception of polarization variable was computed by lining up the individual participants' answers and calculating the difference between how they rated the two parties. Afterwards, the individual's voter turnout was regressed onto their perceived polarization. The results of the regression indicate how strongly correlated perception of polarization and voter turnout are. If the data were to support my hypothesis, the years in which perception of polarization were highest should have had the lowest correlation coefficient, and the years with lower perceived polarization should have had a higher correlation coefficient. I have included my most notable findings here. To begin, as shown by the graph, the perception of polarization was the highest in 2020, with a value of 3.28, and it has been increasing since 2008, when it was at its lowest, with a value of 1.64. This result supported the aspect of the hypothesis that perceived polarization would be highest in 2020. Data for the regression was collected using information from 2008 to 2020, because the ANES had consistent data regarding voter turnout from 2008 onwards. The results found that the correlation between voter turnout and perceived polarization was minimal, especially in 2012 and 2016. However, those values were also found not to be statistically significant. The correlation coefficient in 2020 was 0.03, indicating that a 1-point difference of perceived polarization yields a 3% increased likelihood of turning out to vote. While this may seem small, this indicates that a 6-point difference would increase that likelihood by 18%. As such, the data shows that the relationship between perceived polarization and voter turnout has been increasing since 2012. This graph relates the perception of polarization to the correlation coefficient between perceived polarization and voter turnout of that respective year. It was hypothesized that when perceived polarization reached a level that was too high, it would begin to deter voters. However, as shown by the graph, the relationship between voter turnout and perceived polarization was actually the highest in 2008 and 2020, when the perception of polarization was lowest and highest, respectively. Thus, these results did not support my hypothesis. Ultimately, in the aggregate, the results do not support the notion that levels of perceived polarization that are too high will begin to deter voters. However, it is also important to note the possibility that perceived polarization has not yet reached the level necessary to begin deterring voters, but may do so in the future, giving rise for an extended version of the study. Additional considerations for future studies should include incorporating political literacy and interest in the regression, because political conflict influences voters differently. Moreover, ideological self-placement should be incorporated into the regression because individuals who are more extreme in their ideologies are more likely to vote. Ultimately, the results of the regression will be strengthened by the inclusion of more variables because there are a multitude of factors that influence voting behavior. Although the results did not support the hypothesis, the correlation coefficient in 2020 is notable, and these results can be useful in the conversation regarding controlling access to political information and monitoring civil discourse on social media platforms. Suggestions have been made to monitor and prevent civil discourse because it creates divides and tensions between the parties. However, the results of this study should be taken into account because it provides further evidence that a certain level of political discourse is beneficial to stimulate voter turnout.